welcome Paul Goldman.
The first time I ever saw Rowland, I couldn't take my eyes off him. It was 1979. He was on stage, a cigarette stuck on his bottom lip. He kept lurching and half stumbling forward into the light like some crazy mechanical doll in a Dada ballet, his long tapering fingers scratching and tearing at the 6 strings of his immaculate white Fender Jag that howled and snarled and shrieked as he pummeled and caressed it. He'd momentarily lift his head to reveal that striking, haunted face. Pale, translucent skin, a tangled thatch of black hair, his pale blue eyes fixed on something out there above us in the darkness, something no one else could see. He seemed transfixed, in a trance. He seemed possessed, and it was brilliant. He was inspiring, and that night was unforgettable, full of delirium. It certainly changed my life. Rowland really did look otherworldly, from the beginning to the very end, like a stalking pixie vampire in a silent 1920s German expressionist film. He took your breath away. I've never seen anyone like him. I went backstage that night and met Rolly, but we didn't become friends the first time we met. It wasn't until 15 years later, in the mid-90s, after he'd returned home from living overseas, that we struck up a real friendship. I think we bumped into each other on Fitzroy Street one day, at some cafe probably, and then we just started catching up with each other pretty much every day for a few years. Catching up with Rowland became the highlight of any day. It always was. Because Rowland was a prince, the most charming and dignified and sensitive person I've ever known, and the most stylishly dressed. Full of love and sadness, melancholy and shadows, full of hurt and heartache and thoughtfulness, full of the most intense feelings and gentleness. A complex and complicated man. His life was full of adventures and misadventures, amazing stories, wonderful people, brilliant songs and music. Nobody played guitar like him, and no one sang like him. But it was a brutal life at times, a life that left his body ravaged and broken at the very end. But never his soul, not his heart, not his mind, not his spirit, not his deepest feelings for the people he loved. They were never broken, or not for long anyway. He was vulnerable and fragile, but very, very tough too, our Rolly. He was flawed and he had weaknesses, but he was brave and strong. There was folly and stupidity along the way, but he was honest with himself. His mind was razor sharp, his imagination rollicking and boundless. He was a harsh judge and critic, but generous and open-hearted, full of praise and encouragement and devilish humour. His friendship meant more to me than he'll ever know. I've treasured it for 15 years. It was always a pure delight. He was a wonderful friend to me. Serious one moment, laughing the next. I always enjoyed hearing that dry, scoffing mock laugh of his as the idiocies fell from my own mouth. I enjoyed the warmth and affection of his smile, the twinkle of wry amusement in his eyes. His uncompromising attitude to work, to creating songs and music, have always been an inspiration to me personally, a constant touchstone and reminder about the things that matter most. Rowland always put all of himself, heart and soul, on the line. Rolly enjoyed life and enjoyed life's temptations. Of course, he paid a cruel price in the end, but not grudgingly, not with any complaint or self-pity. He greeted everything with that smile of his and all the wisdom and acceptance of the knowing soul he was. I've spent 30 years watching and listening to Rolly on stage and in recording studios, talking to him in cafes and restaurants, sitting around our homes together, walking down the streets of St Kilda with him, sharing stories and friends. And right up until the very end, it was a rare pleasure. I love you very much, Rolly. I already miss you. We all do and always will. We have the music and the memories to share. I can still hear you, Rolly. I can still see you, luminescent. I'd also like to read something that Andrew Dominic sent. Andrew actually flew in and arrived from Los Angeles and actually arrived the morning that Rolly died. Andy can't be here today. He had to go back to look after his son, Jesse. But he asked me to read this on his behalf and just to tell everyone that Rolly meant an awful lot to him. In fact, Rowland was the person who recommended that Andrew make the Ron Hansen book, The Assassination of Jesse James, into a film. And I know that when Andrew was writing, Rolly was one of the few people that Andy would trust with the work that he was doing and ask for his opinion. Rowland was special. Some people just are. We are not all created equal. The Rowland I knew had an air of aristocracy. He was like royalty in exile, a man walking through the ashes of something, who always carried himself with dignity. I don't know whether Rowland was fragile or strong, but as I got to know him, I realised he was remarkably free of self-pity. Rowland accepted himself and others as they were, and he was not blind about it. He could see people's limitations. He had the ability to be close to others. He was curious. He was patient. If you were in pain or anxious, Rowland would always do something about it. Rowland knew his own heart. Rowland could be selfish, but Rowland could love. I know this because he loved me. Rowland was one of my very best friends. When I heard he had cancer and called him to talk about it, he said that he had moments of fear, moments of loneliness, but that he couldn't really imagine dying, so he wasn't going to bother. I've always imagined that death is something you need to prepare yourself for, but perhaps Rowland was much more sensible. He realised he was powerless and decided to get on with his life, and it was certainly dignified. I didn't see him at the end, but I imagine his spirit would have been shining from him. I feel a great deal of gratitude towards Jen and Bianca, Jane and Tom, and Mick Harvey. Rowland may have been coughing blood, but he was in great spirits about the record. He knew he'd done something very special. I loved Rowland. I remember seeing him once after a long separation, and the two of us were so overjoyed that we walked down the street together holding hands until it became embarrassing for both of us. I'm sure he did. I miss you. I don't know where he is. I'm glad he's not in pain, but I think he had much more to offer, and I wish he was still here.